No one showed up, until one little girl walked in. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the rest of this journey. The Mitchell estate sat on the quiet ridges of Greenwich, Connecticut, where sprawling lawns blended with the edge of the Long Island Sound. To outsiders, it looked like a fortress of wealth, slate roofs, marble columns, and manicured hedges standing guard as if to remind the world that power lived here. But behind the heavy glass doors, on a warm afternoon in May, there was only silence, and a boy staring at a cake no one came to share. Ethan Mitchell was 9 years old. His chestnut hair fell neatly against his forehead, his pale hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. Balloons floated above him, blue, silver, and gold, and a 4-tiered cake towered at the center of the long dining table. The scent of vanilla buttercream filled the air, cloying against the emptiness. Chairs lined the room, each tied with ribbons, each waiting for a child who never arrived. He tried to hold his breath and count. 1 minute, 5, 10. Maybe someone was late. Maybe the kids from Westport Prep had just missed the shuttle. Maybe a parent got lost in traffic. But deep down, Ethan already knew. His accident had changed everything. The car crash had happened a year ago on I-95, the stretch of highway connecting Stamford to New Haven. A delivery truck swerved into their lane. His mother, seated in the passenger seat, never made it. Ethan survived, but his legs no longer worked. From that day on, whispers followed him. First pity, then avoidance. Soon, cruelty. Now, on his birthday, the whispers had turned into absence. Robert Mitchell stood at the far end of the room, his arms folded, his jaw tight. 50 years old, sharp in a tailored Navy suit, he was the kind of man who could command a boardroom of pharmaceutical executives with a single glance. Yet in this moment, he looked powerless. A father unable to shield his son from the loneliness money could not buy away. He had spared no expense. Invitations were embossed with gold leaf. A magician had been hired. Caterers stood idle near the kitchen, their trays of hors d'oeuvres untouched. Outside, in the driveway lined with Bentleys and Teslas, not a single car had pulled up to the iron gates. "Dad," Ethan's voice cracked. Did you send the invitations?" Robert's chest ached. "Of course I did. Everyone said they'd come." The boy turned his eyes toward the balloons. He watched one tug against the string as if trying to float free. "They don't want to be here," he whispered. "Because of me." Robert stepped closer, his shoes clicking softly against the polished wood floor. He crouched beside his son, lowering himself until they were eye to eye. "Ethan, listen to me. This isn't your fault. Sometimes people show who they really are by not showing up." But Ethan shook his head. His hands trembled against the wheels of his chair. "They think I'm broken." The words pierced Robert more deeply than any corporate loss or lawsuit ever had. He had spent his career building Mitchell Pharmaceuticals into a household name, discovering drugs that prolonged lives across continents. Yet he could not invent a cure for his son's isolation. The candles on the cake flickered, 24 flames against the dimmed room. The magician cleared his throat awkwardly from the corner. One of the caterers glanced at the clock. "Maybe we should just cut the cake?" the event planner murmured timidly. Robert's glare silenced her. His hand tightened on Ethan's shoulder, firm but trembling. Then Ethan blew. Not with joy, not with laughter, but with resignation. His breath snuffed out every flame, leaving trails of smoke that curled toward the high ceiling like ghosts of wishes that never had a chance. Robert rose, fury simmering behind his composed exterior. He wanted to storm to Westport, to confront the parents, to demand why their children had abandoned his boy. But he could not move. His feet felt heavy, nailed to the polished floor of his gilded prison. Happy birthday to me, Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice breaking into a sob. And in that moment, Robert realized what his fortune could not hide. His son was alone. Outside, beyond the wrought iron gates, the wind carried the sound of laughter from a passing group of children playing on the street. A balloon, bright red and loose from its string, floated over the hedge and drifted across the estate lawn. At the far corner, where the shadows of the hedge met the brightness of spring sun, a figure paused. A little girl. She was small, 6 years old perhaps, with hair braided neatly into twin plaits and skin that glowed against the afternoon light. She clutched a worn school bag, her sneakers scuffed from city sidewalks. Her mother had brought her up from Harlem that day, running errands nearby, and Amira Johnson had wandered just far enough to see the balloons from across the fence. She pressed her face to the iron bars, wide eyes drinking in the sight of a party that seemed untouched. Her lips moved silently, mouthing the words, "Happy birthday," though no one heard her. Not yet. Inside, Robert placed his hand on his son's back. He looked down at the boy whose shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and something inside him cracked. He was not angry at his son. He was angry at a world that had no space for imperfection. And yet, in that hollow silence, the universe was already sending him an answer. The day after his birthday, the Mitchell estate felt heavier than ever. The balloons had deflated, the cake sat untouched in the refrigerator, and Ethan wheeled himself quietly through the corridors with eyes fixed on the ground. Robert had ordered the decorations to be removed, yet the faint scent of frosting lingered in the air like a cruel reminder. But outside, life went on. Harlem, more than 40 miles south of Greenwich, pulsed with a different rhythm. Brownstone buildings lined the streets, painted with murals of jazz legends and civil rights icons. The hum of buses, corner stores, and children playing double dutch mixed together into a music of resilience. Here, every block told a story of survival, of families holding one another up against the odds. It was in one of those narrow apartments that Amira Johnson lived with her mother, Danielle. At 6 years old, Amira carried a brightness that seemed too large for her small frame. She wore her hair in 2 braids every morning before school, humming as her mother adjusted the faded straps of her backpack. Danielle, a night shift nurse at New York Presbyterian Hospital, often left home with tired eyes, but she never failed to tuck a kiss against her daughter's forehead. On the morning after Ethan's lonely party, Amira was skipping rope in the small courtyard outside their building when she noticed something odd. A balloon. Blue, its ribbon frayed, drifting lazily across the sky. She ran after it, giggling, until it caught against a lamppost. "Make a wish, Amy," her neighbor called from the stoop. "Catching balloons means good luck." Amira clasped the ribbon in her hand, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I wish I could make someone happy today." Fate, it seemed, was already weaving her path toward Greenwich. The very same afternoon, Robert Mitchell found himself restless. He had postponed a meeting on Wall Street to spend time with his son, but Ethan refused to leave his room. In his father's eyes, Ethan was retreating deeper into silence, building a wall higher than Robert could climb. "Sir," the housekeeper murmured, "there's a child outside the gate." Robert frowned. "What child?" "She looks lost or curious. She's staring at the balloons we still haven't taken down." Robert moved to the window. And there she was, small, fragile, pressing her face against the iron bars like a bird peering into a world it did not belong to. He almost ordered security to escort her away, but something in her eyes made him pause. They weren't the eyes of a trespasser. They were the eyes of a child who still believed in magic. He told the guard to let her in. When the gates opened, Amira stepped onto the long driveway with hesitant steps. She held the balloon tightly. The string wound twice around her wrist. Her sneakers squeaked against the gravel. Inside, Ethan sat in his wheelchair near the window, pretending to read a book he had no interest in. When the door creaked, he turned, and his breath caught. Standing in the grand foyer, dwarfed by marble columns, was a little girl he had never seen before. "Hi," she said, her voice high and clear. "I saw the balloons. Was it your birthday?" Ethan blinked, unsure whether to answer. For months, children from his school had only come close enough to mock him. Now here was a stranger, uninvited, asking without cruelty. "Yes," he whispered finally. "Yesterday." Amira's face lit up. "Happy birthday." She looked down at her hands. "I don't have a gift, but I can sing." Before Robert could intervene, she began. Her voice was thin but earnest, carrying the melody of a song her mother often hummed after long hospital shifts. It wasn't polished, but it was pure. "Happy birthday to you." Ethan's lips twitched. Then, for the first time since the accident, laughter broke from his chest. Small, trembling, but real. Robert froze, stunned. He hadn't heard that sound in over a year. When the song ended, Amira curtsied dramatically, making Ethan giggle again. "You're silly," Ethan said. "Better than being sad," she replied. Those words landed like sunlight through a cracked window. Robert invited her to sit, his voice uncertain. "Where's your mother?" "She's working," Amira explained proudly. "She's a nurse. She helps sick kids. I was just walking and saw your balloons." Robert studied her. Her clothes were simple, her shoes worn thin, yet she carried herself with a dignity far greater than many women he knew at corporate galas. "Do you want some cake?" Ethan asked suddenly. Her eyes widened. "Cake?" Minutes later, the three of them sat at the long dining table. The cake, untouched the day before, was finally cut. Ethan placed a slice onto Amira's plate with careful hands. She took a bite, her face brightening as though it were the best thing she had ever tasted. "This is the fanciest cake I've ever had," she said between mouthfuls. "It's like eating clouds." Ethan grinned. "It tastes better because you're here." Robert's chest tightened. In all his years of commanding empires, he had never felt a boardroom victory as deeply as he felt that moment. His son was smiling. His son was alive again, if only for an instant. As evening shadows stretched across Greenwich, Amira prepared to leave. She tied the balloon to Ethan's chair. "Now you'll always have good luck." He looked at her, his voice trembling. "Will you come back?" She shrugged. "If you want me to." Ethan nodded eagerly. "I do." Robert watched the exchange silently. He didn't know what to make of this child from Harlem, with her unpolished shoes and radiant heart. But he knew this. She had given his son something all his wealth could not buy. Hope. The house was strangely alive the week after Amira first walked through its gates. Ethan had laughed twice, once during dinner when Amira compared the butler's polished shoes to mirror floors, and again when she brought him a book of riddles she found in her school library. Robert noticed it all. For a man accustomed to quarterly earnings reports and clinical trial data, the sound of his son's laughter was worth more than every stock share in Mitchell Pharmaceuticals. Robert wanted to believe this new light would last, yet he also knew the world beyond his gates was less forgiving, and it wasn't long before that world intruded. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Robert was in his office overlooking the Sound, the phone glowing with a number from Westport, Connecticut. He answered, his voice crisp. "Robert Mitchell," he said. "Robert, this is Patricia Collins." He leaned back. Patricia, president of the parent council at Westport Prep, the elite private school where Ethan had been enrolled since kindergarten. Robert had endured dozens of her fundraisers, brunches, and lectures on maintaining standards. She was one of those women whose pearls seemed as permanent as her disdain for anyone who didn't belong to her circle. "Patricia," Robert said cautiously, "what can I do for you?" There was a pause, heavy with practiced politeness. "It's about Ethan." Robert's jaw tensed. "What about him?" "Well, the children talk. They notice things. We all do. And I've heard," her voice dropped, sugar laced with steel, "that your son has been spending time with a girl from Harlem." Robert's grip on the phone tightened. "Her name is Amira Johnson." "Yes," Patricia replied, her tone sharp. "That girl. Robert, you know as well as I do. Our school has a reputation. We cultivate excellence. Families invest in that reputation. Bringing in outsiders, children with no pedigree, no resources, well, it sets a tone. And frankly, it makes parents uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Robert's voice hardened. "You must understand, Robert. Ethan already has challenges. His accident, his condition. It is tragic, of course, but pairing him with a child from Harlem, a child whose mother, I believe, works night shifts as a nurse, it gives the impression of—" She searched for the word, and when it came, it was a knife. "Decline." Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "Decline? Patricia, are you suggesting my son shouldn't have friends unless they fit your ridiculous criteria?" "I'm suggesting," she said smoothly, "that if you want Ethan to remain part of Westport Prep's community, you'll reconsider the company he keeps. We can't allow associations that tarnish the school's image. Surely you understand reputations are fragile." Robert stared out the window, fury boiling beneath his calm exterior. Below, Ethan was in the garden, Amira pushing his wheelchair across the lawn as they laughed over something small, a joke, a flower, the shared discovery of joy. Two children who saw only friendship, while the adults around them saw barriers. "I understand," Robert said slowly, his voice low and cold, "that you've just shown me exactly what's wrong with our so-called community." "Robert!" Patricia's voice sharpened. "Be careful! You don't want to be on the wrong side of this!" He hung up. The click echoed like a slammed door. That evening, Robert replayed the conversation in his mind as he sat across from Ethan at dinner. The boy was animated, telling him how Amira had made him try to solve a riddle. What has hands but can't clap? Ethan grinned when he gave the answer. A clock. For the first time in months, Ethan's eyes glowed. But beneath that glow, Robert saw the shadow of what Patricia had said. The world beyond their table didn't see Ethan's joy. It saw his weakness. It didn't see Amira's kindness. It saw her poverty. And Robert, who had spent decades in a world where power meant control, realized he was facing an enemy he couldn't silence with contracts or capital. He was facing prejudice, polished, polite, and poisonous. The next day, whispers began at Westport Prep. Ethan noticed the way his classmates pulled back when he rolled into the cafeteria. He heard the murmurs, "He's friends with that Harlem girl. His dad lets anyone into their house." The sting was sharper than any playground insult, because it was taught. It came from the parents who shaped their words. That afternoon, Robert picked Ethan up himself. He found his son staring out the car window, fists clenched on his lap. "Rough day?" Robert asked gently. Ethan didn't answer. Not until they turned onto their street in Greenwich, where the manicured lawns glowed in the fading sunlight. Finally, he whispered, "Dad, why do they hate Amira?" Robert's hands tightened on the wheel. They don't hate her, Ethan. They fear what she represents. What does she represent? Robert exhaled. The truth. That kindness matters more than privilege, and people who build their lives on privilege don't want to hear that. Ethan turned his head. His eyes, tired but defiant, met his father's. Then I don't want to be like them. Robert swallowed hard. His son was only 9. Yet he had already seen the ugliness of a world his father had once embraced without question. In that moment, Robert vowed he would no longer play by their rules. If it meant standing alone, so be it. That night, as Ethan and Amira played chess in the library, Amira giggling every time she accidentally shouted, "Check!" Robert watched from the doorway. Patricia Collins and her circle might wield power in Westport. They might whisper, threaten, even ostracize. But here, in the laughter of these two children, Robert saw a greater power. Not the power of wealth, not the power of reputation, the power of healing. And Robert knew then he would fight to protect it. The whispers began quietly, like a draft through a closed door. Ethan first noticed them in the cafeteria at Westport Prep, when he wheeled toward a table with his lunch tray balanced carefully across his lap. The chatter hushed. A few boys leaned closer together, their mouths twitching as if suppressing laughter. One muttered something Ethan couldn't catch, but the rest grinned, eyes flicking toward his chair. He tried to ignore it. He kept rolling forward. But as he passed, he heard the hiss of a word that made his chest tighten. Cripple. The tray rattled as his hands froze against the wheels. His eyes burned, but he forced himself onward, choosing an empty table at the corner of the room. He ate in silence, every bite tasting like metal. Across town, in Harlem, Amira faced her own version of cruelty. A group of older girls from her block had cornered her after school, arms folded, lips curling. "You think you're special now?" one sneered. "Walking into some rich man's house like you belong there?" Amira clutched her worn backpack tighter. "He invited me." "His son is my friend." The girls burst out laughing. "Friend? He's a crippled millionaire. You're just a poor black girl from the projects. He doesn't need you. He's just bored." The words stung, not because Amira believed them, but because she could feel their intent, to plant doubt in her heart. She ran home, tears streaming, but stopped short at her door. Her mother had enough burdens. Danielle didn't need to hear about playground cruelty, so Amira wiped her eyes, fixed her braids, and smiled as if nothing had happened. At school the next week, the cruelty grew bolder. Ethan overheard classmates whispering nicknames. Wheel Boy. The Cripple Prince. One even mimicked the squeak of his chair as he rolled past. The hardest blow came one Friday when he entered history class. Taped to the back of his chair was a crude drawing, a stick figure slumped in a wheelchair, a balloon tied to its arm. The caption read, "Needs Harlem Helper." The class erupted in giggles. Ethan's face burned. His teacher hesitated, torn between scolding and pretending not to notice. In the end, she said nothing. Silence became complicity. Ethan tore the paper off, crumpled it, and shoved it into his pocket. For the rest of the day, he said nothing. That afternoon, Robert arrived to pick him up. He had cleared his calendar, determined to be present, to catch any glimpse of what his son endured. He parked the black sedan just outside the gates and waited. When Ethan emerged, his head was bowed low, his hands gripping the wheels so tightly his knuckles whitened. Robert stepped out of the car. "Rough day?" he asked softly. Ethan didn't answer. His lips trembled. And then Robert saw it, the crumpled paper falling from Ethan's pocket as he shifted in his chair. He bent down, unfolded it, and froze. The drawing, the cruel caption, his son's humiliation in ink. "Ethan," Robert whispered, his voice cracking. "Who did this?" Ethan's shoulders shook. He turned his face away. Tears streaked down his cheeks as he whispered, "I don't care. I just want one real friend. Dad, they hate me. They hate Amira. And I don't know why." Robert felt something inside him shatter. His empire on Wall Street, his accolades, his wealth, none of it mattered if his son believed himself unworthy of love. He crouched, gripping Ethan's trembling hands. "Listen to me. You are not broken, and Amira, she is the bravest, kindest friend I've ever met. If they can't see that, then shame on them, not on you." But Ethan shook his head, sobbing harder. "They won't stop. No matter what you say, they won't stop." Robert held him close, feeling the fragile weight of his son's despair. And for the first time in his life, Robert Mitchell, the man who had stared down senators and CEOs, felt utterly powerless. That evening, Robert drove Ethan straight to Harlem. He didn't call ahead. He didn't warn Danielle. He simply needed his son to be where kindness was not conditional. When they arrived, Amira was sitting on the stoop, humming to herself, drawing flowers in the margins of a notebook. She looked up and beamed. "Ethan?" For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He wiped his tears quickly, embarrassed. But Amira ran to him, crouched beside his chair, and grinned. "I learned a new riddle. Want to hear it?" Despite himself, Ethan nodded. "What has a bed but never sleeps, a mouth but never eats?" Ethan frowned, thinking hard. "A river?" Amira clapped. "See? You're smart. Smarter than anyone at my school." Her words landed like a bomb. Ethan exhaled, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. Robert watched the exchange with quiet awe. Two children, one carrying scars no eye could see, the other carrying burdens no child should know. And yet, together, they created light. Danielle appeared in the doorway, apron still tied from her shift at the hospital. She looked at Robert with surprise, then concern. "Everything all right?" Robert's voice was low, but steady. "No. And that's why I'm here. Because if this world insists on teaching cruelty, then maybe we need to start teaching something else." Danielle held his gaze, understanding dawning. She stepped aside and gestured toward the warm glow of their small apartment. "Then come in. Let's start here." That night, as Amira and Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor playing a board game, Robert and Danielle talked quietly at the kitchen table. She told him about the long hours, the patients she couldn't save, the children in Harlem who came to the ER malnourished. Robert listened, not as a CEO gathering data, but as a father, humbled. For the first time, he admitted out loud, "I don't know how to protect my son anymore." Danielle's voice was soft but resolute. "You don't have to protect him from the world. You just have to teach him how to face it, with people who stand beside him." Robert looked over at the children, their laughter spilling across the tiny kitchen. He realized then that the fight wasn't about reputation or status or money. It was about giving Ethan the strength to choose love over cruelty and protecting the girl who had given him back his smile. The black sedan looked out of place on the narrow Harlem street. The Mitchell driver wanted to wait a block away, but Robert insisted on pulling up directly in front of the building. His son had asked for it. No, begged for it. "Dad, please," Ethan had whispered that morning. "I want to see where Amira lives." So now, for the first time in years, Robert Mitchell stood outside a modest brick apartment building, its steps chipped from decades of wear, its front door painted a dull green that had faded under countless winters. To most, it was unremarkable. To Robert, who had spent his life behind gilded gates and guarded lobbies, it was foreign, yet strangely honest. Ethan shifted in his wheelchair as his father wheeled him toward the entrance. His eyes darted nervously, but also with curiosity. For months he had been told who he could and couldn't be friends with, where he did and didn't belong. For once, he wanted to see the truth for himself. Amira greeted them at the door, her braids bouncing as she smiled. "Ethan, you came!" Behind her stood Danielle Johnson, her mother still in her scrubs from a 12-hour night shift at New York Presbyterian Hospital. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed exhaustion, but her smile carried genuine warmth. "Mr. Mitchell?" Danielle said softly, extending her hand. "I didn't expect, well, anyone like you here." Robert took her hand firmly. "Please, call me Robert, and thank you for letting us visit." Danielle stepped aside. "Come in. Forgive the mess. Night shifts don't leave much time for housekeeping." But the truth was, the apartment wasn't messy at all. It was small, 2 rooms, one serving as both living room and bedroom, but spotless. The faint scent of lavender hung in the air, and on the wall were taped drawings Amira had made. Flowers, city skylines, one sketch of a little girl wearing a nurse's cap. Ethan looked around with wide eyes. "It's nice," he said honestly. "It feels happy." Danielle chuckled. "Happy is what we try for, even when it's hard." They sat together around the small kitchen table. Robert, more accustomed to mahogany conference tables and crystal glasses, noticed how Danielle poured water into mismatched mugs. He noticed, too, how she carried herself, not with bitterness for what she lacked, but with pride for what she had built. "You work at New York Presbyterian?" Robert asked. Danielle nodded. "Pediatric wing, mostly. Kids with chronic illnesses, rare conditions, families who can't always afford consistent care." Robert leaned forward. "That's noble work. But isn't it exhausting?" "Of course it is." Danielle's eyes softened as she glanced at her daughter. "But when I see a child smile through their pain, it's worth more than any paycheck. That's why I do it." Amira, listening, piped up eagerly. "I'm going to be a doctor too. I already read Mommy's books. Not all the big words yet, but some. Did you know the heart has 4 chambers? And that blood is blue before it turns red?" Ethan blinked. "Really?" "Really," Amira said proudly. "And one day, I'll open a hospital for kids who can't pay. Everyone deserves to be healthy." Robert was struck silent, a 6-year-old, speaking with conviction stronger than most executives he had ever met. He saw the way Ethan's face lit up, how he leaned forward, absorbing every word. "You're amazing," Ethan said quietly. Amira grinned. "No, I'm just me." After dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti Danielle had thrown together with what she had, the children played in the living room. Ethan guided the pieces of a puzzle with careful hands, while Amira read instructions aloud. Their laughter filled the small apartment, spilling into the hallway. Robert stayed in the kitchen with Danielle. His voice was low, respectful. "Your daughter. She's extraordinary." Danielle's tired eyes glistened with pride. "She's my world. She's had to grow up fast, but she never complains. She just keeps giving." Robert studied her. This woman who worked nights in a hospital and days raising a daughter in a tiny apartment radiated a strength that no wealth could buy. He thought of Patricia Collins and her polished cruelty and felt disgust twist in his stomach. "Do you know," Robert said quietly, "that people at Ethan's school are telling him not to be friends with your daughter?" Danielle stiffened. "Because of us?" Because of prejudice, Robert corrected sharply. They see class, they see color, they don't see her heart, or his. Danielle sighed. I've lived with that all my life, Mr. Mitchell, but I won't let it dim who she is. She'll shine, no matter who tries to snuff it out. Robert nodded slowly. He realized then that his son wasn't the only one who needed healing. He, too, needed to see beyond the polished world he had built. And it started here, in this tiny Harlem apartment. When it was time to leave, Ethan protested. Can't we stay longer? Robert smiled gently. We'll come back. I promise. At the doorway, Amira untied one of her drawings from the wall, a picture of two stick figures, one in a wheelchair and one holding a balloon. She pressed it into Ethan's hands. So you won't forget. Ethan clutched it tightly. I won't. Danielle looked at Robert, her voice quiet but firm. Whatever storm is coming from your world, just remember, our children are innocent. They deserve better than to be pawns in anyone's game. Robert met her gaze. You have my word. I'll protect them both. As the sedan pulled away from Harlem, Ethan stared at the drawing on his lap. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a boy with a friend, and a promise worth fighting for. Robert, glancing at his son's quiet smile, thought of Danielle's words. Storms were indeed coming, but for the first time he welcomed the fight, because now he had something real to defend. Spring rain lashed against the glass walls of the Mitchell headquarters in Stamford. Robert stood in his corner office, gazing down at the city, his reflection pale against the skyline. He had spent decades building Mitchell Pharmaceuticals into one of the nation's leading companies. Yet in recent weeks, he could feel something shifting, something dark threading its way into both his personal and professional life. It began with a phone call from his general counsel. Robert, I don't know how to say this delicately. The Morgan Group pulled out of the joint research deal. They cited reputational concerns. Robert's jaw clenched. Reputational? We're on the brink of FDA approval. This is about Ethan, isn't it? The lawyer hesitated. Unofficially, yes. Word is spreading in certain circles. Parents from Westport, Patricia Collins, they don't like your association with Harlem, with the Johnsons. Robert slammed the phone down so hard the frame rattled on his desk. Wealth and reputation, their weapons were the same. They couldn't attack his son directly, so they aimed at the empire Robert had built. The pressure mounted. At Westport Prep, Ethan came home with stories of whispered taunts and teachers who looked the other way. They call me Wheel Boy, he admitted one night, tears streaking down his cheeks. They say Amira is using me. Dad, I don't even want to go back. Robert pulled him close, fighting the urge to rage. You are not what they say. You are my son. And Amira is your friend. Nothing they do can change that. But Robert knew words weren't enough. Days later, an envelope arrived at their Greenwich estate. Inside was a letter from the Westchester Golf Club, where Robert had been a member for 20 years. Dear Mr. Mitchell, it read in pristine calligraphy. It has come to our attention that recent events have reflected poorly on the standards of our club. Effective immediately, your membership has been suspended pending review. Robert crushed the letter in his fist. That evening, he found Ethan alone in his room, the paper still taped to his wheelchair, the one Amira had given him, the drawing of two stick figures holding a balloon. Ethan's eyes brimmed with anger. I don't understand, the boy whispered. Why do they hate us? Why do they hate Amira? Robert crouched in front of him, gripping his shoulders. Because we remind them of the truth. They built their lives on glass, Ethan. Amira shows them how fragile it really is. Ethan's voice broke. Dad, I just want a real friend. I don't care about schools or golf clubs or your company. I just want someone who doesn't see me as broken." The words hit Robert harder than any boardroom defeat. His son wasn't asking for wealth, power, or prestige. He was asking for belonging, for love, and the world had decided to deny it. Robert closed his eyes, fury and grief intertwining. This was no longer about corporate contracts or country clubs. This was war, a coordinated attack on a child, on two children. The storm reached its breaking point one Friday evening. Ethan had just returned from school, his eyes red from crying. He clutched his backpack like a shield and refused to meet his father's gaze. Robert wheeled him inside gently. "What happened?" Ethan shook his head, then finally whispered, "They told me if I keep being friends with Amira, I'll never have friends again. They said their parents don't want them near me. Dad, they hate me for choosing her." His voice cracked into a sob. "Why is being her friend so wrong?" Robert's chest burned. He pulled his son into his arms, the boy's thin shoulders shaking against him. He wanted to scream, to tear down every marble wall of Westport Prep, to shout at the world until it listened, but instead he held his son tightly and whispered, "It isn't wrong. It is the bravest thing you've ever done, and I will stand with you. Always." Later that night, Robert poured himself a glass of scotch and stared out the window of his study. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the lights of Greenwich into ghostly shapes. The attacks were coordinated, deliberate. Patricia Collins and her circle were pulling strings. Business partners, school administrators, social clubs. They wanted to isolate Ethan, to drive Amira back into silence, to remind Robert that even his billions couldn't rewrite their rules. But what they didn't understand was that Robert Mitchell had nothing left to lose but the truth. His wife was gone. His son was wounded. His own heart was cracked wide open. He would not let these people poison what little joy remained in his family's life. When the phone rang, he snatched it up. It was Dr. James Walker, his oldest friend and legal advisor. "Robert," James said, his voice grim, "I've been digging. You were right. It's not just gossip. Patricia and her allies are orchestrating a full-scale campaign, and I found something else. Something bigger. I'll bring the files tomorrow." Robert set the glass down with a decisive thud. "Good. Because I'm done playing defense. If they want war, I'll give them war." The next morning, Ethan wheeled himself into the breakfast room. He looked tired, but when Amira arrived with a bag of muffins she and her mother had baked, his face lit up again. She sat beside him, breaking a muffin in half. "Don't listen to them, Ethan. You're not alone. You have me." His small hands shook as he reached for hers. "I know. And that's what scares them." Robert watched from the doorway, his heart torn between pride and rage. Two children, one bound to a chair, the other bound to poverty, had more courage than the entire council of Westport. He swore then, as he had never sworn before, that he would burn down every false pillar of their power if it meant these children could live free of fear. The attack was coordinated, but so was his resolve. The morning sky over Stamford was steel gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Robert Mitchell stood in his study, fingers drumming on the mahogany desk, waiting for his oldest friend to arrive. He hadn't slept. His mind replayed Ethan's sobs, Patricia's venom-laced voice, the humiliation of the golf club's letter. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was an assault designed to isolate his son and erase Amira from their lives. When the doorbell rang, Robert opened it himself. Dr. James Walker, tall and lean with streaks of gray in his hair, carried a battered leather briefcase under his arm. His eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, held none of the warmth they usually carried. "Robert," he said without preamble, "we need to talk." They sat at the long dining table. James set the briefcase down, unlatched it, and spread out folders, printouts, flash drives. Robert's pulse quickened. He recognized the look of a man who had uncovered something that mattered. "What did you find?" Robert asked. James pushed a document across the table. "This is bigger than schoolyard bullying. Patricia Collins and her circle have been maneuvering behind the scenes for months, and it's not just about Ethan or Amira, it's about Harlem itself." Robert scanned the papers. City council memos, development proposals, bank transfers. "Stamford?" he muttered. "Yes," James replied grimly. "Patricia is spearheading a deal with several council members to seize and demolish a housing block in Harlem, the very block where Danielle and Amira live. They want to level it and build luxury condominiums. It's gentrification." Robert masked as urban renewal. Robert's jaw tightened. "And the families? Displaced, paid a pittance, forgotten. You know the script." Robert shoved the papers aside, fury rising in his chest. "So this is why they're coming after me. If Ethan befriends a Harlem girl, it humanizes her. It humanizes all of them. It threatens their narrative that Harlem is disposable." James nodded. "They fear the story. A wealthy CEO's paralyzed son befriending a black girl from Harlem undermines everything they're selling. If people see that friendship, the public might question why children like Amira are being pushed out." Robert's hands clenched into fists. He looked toward the window where Ethan and Amira played chess in the garden, their laughter faint through the glass. Two children who wanted nothing more than to share a piece of joy. And yet, their innocence had become a threat to the powerful. That evening, Robert drove to Harlem himself. The rain had begun, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the windshield. When he arrived at the Johnsons' apartment, Danielle opened the door, her expression weary but warm. "You shouldn't be here in this weather," she said softly. "I need to talk to you," Robert replied. Inside, he spread the documents across their small kitchen table. Danielle's eyes widened as she read them. "They want to take our building?" she whispered. "Our home?" "Yes," Robert said. "Yours and hundreds of others, unless we stop them." Danielle sank into a chair, hand pressed to her forehead. "I've seen families lose everything before, Robert, but to know they're targeting us deliberately..." Robert leaned forward, voice steady. "This isn't just about real estate, it's about power. Patricia and her circle want to prove that people like you don't belong, and they're using my son's friendship as leverage to isolate me." From the living room, Amira's voice rang out. "Checkmate, Ethan!" The two adults exchanged glances. Danielle's eyes filled with tears. "She's only 6. She shouldn't have to fight this battle." Robert reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Then let me fight it. For her, for Ethan, for all of them." The next day, James brought more. Audio recordings, Patricia's voice hissing into the phone about keeping Harlem contained. Emails boasting of kickbacks. Signed agreements with construction firms. Robert listened, every word fueling his resolve. For decades, he had played the game of the elite, suits, dinners, donations. He had known corruption existed, but never had it cut so close. Never had it threatened the very children he loved. "We take this public," James said. "Expose it. With the evidence we have, we can trigger an investigation. The press will swarm it. The council will be forced to act." Robert nodded. "Yes, but I want more. I want them humiliated the way they humiliated Ethan. I want the world to see who they really are." James studied him. "You're ready to burn bridges." Robert's eyes were steel. "Let them burn." That night, Robert returned home to Greenwich. He found Ethan in the library, Amira by his side, both bent over a medical book Amira had borrowed from the hospital library where her mother worked. "Did you know," Amira said brightly, pointing at the page. That broken bones can heal stronger than before? Ethan smiled faintly. So maybe people can too. Robert's throat tightened. He stood silently in the doorway, the words echoing in his heart. Broken bones can heal stronger than before. Perhaps this was what all of them were being called to learn, but healing would not come without a fight. He stepped into the room, laying a hand on his son's shoulder. Ethan, Amira, how would you feel about speaking the truth, about telling people what's really happening? The children exchanged a glance. Amira tilted her chin. If it helps my mom, if it helps our building, then yes. Ethan nodded firmly. I'm not afraid anymore, Dad. Robert looked at them both, his son's only friend, and felt something fierce rise within him. The empire he had built, the fortune he had earned, none of it mattered compared to the light in these children's eyes. He would wield every ounce of his power, every resource at his disposal to protect them. The secret files had given him the weapon. Now it was time to use it. The council chambers of Stamford City Hall had never seen so many people. Reporters jostled for position at the back of the room, cameras flashing as residents from Harlem filled the gallery, their voices low but urgent. At the front, beneath the seal of the city, a long mahogany table gleamed beneath fluorescent lights. Behind it sat members of the council, faces tight with the strain of a decision they thought would pass quietly. But this day would not be quiet. Robert Mitchell stood near the center aisle, shoulders squared, the weight of decades of corporate power behind him. But for once, he was not here as the CEO of Mitchell Pharmaceuticals. He was here as a father, as a man unwilling to let greed erase the home of a little girl who had given his son hope. Beside him sat Danielle Johnson. Her nurse's scrubs freshly pressed, though her eyes carried the exhaustion of countless night shifts. And between them, small but unshaken, sat Amira, clutching Ethan's hand as he sat in his wheelchair. The murmurs grew as Patricia Collins swept into the chamber, pearls around her neck, her smile sharp as glass. She took her place at the front row, flanked by lawyers and developers in dark suits. She radiated confidence, certain the vote would go her way. The council chair banged the gavel. This meeting of the Stamford City Council will come to order. Today's agenda, proposal number 3117, the redevelopment of the Harlem housing block. Patricia's attorney rose first, voice smooth. Ladies and gentlemen, this project represents progress. We are offering state-of-the-art condominiums, commercial space, and new jobs for the community. Harlem deserves renewal, not decay. Applause rippled through Patricia's supporters. Robert rose slowly, the weight of silence following him as he stepped toward the microphone. His voice carried across the chamber, steady but charged. Renewal, he repeated. Is that what you call tearing families from their homes, displacing children, calling it progress while lining your pockets with blood money? A stir swept the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. Patricia's lips tightened. Mr. Mitchell, she interrupted, her tone cutting. This is a city matter, not a personal one. You should sit down. Robert turned, locking eyes with her. Personal? My son has been bullied, humiliated, ostracized, all because he dared to be friends with a girl whose home you are trying to destroy. Don't tell me this isn't personal. It is personal to every family sitting in this room, waiting to find out if tomorrow they'll still have a roof over their heads. Cheers erupted from the Harlem residents in the gallery. The gavel banged again. Order! Then James Walker stepped forward, his leather briefcase in hand, his voice cut like steel. Council members, my name is Dr. James Walker. I am legal counsel for Robert Mitchell. What you have just heard is not merely moral outrage, it is legal fact, and I have the evidence to prove it. He spread out files across the council table. Here are emails between Patricia Collins and members of this very council discussing kickbacks in exchange for votes. Here are bank records showing payments disguised as consulting fees. And here, he held up a recorder, pressing play. Patricia's voice filled the chamber cold and clear. We need to keep Harlem contained. If the Mitchell boy keeps parading that Johnson girl around, people will start to sympathize. We can't have that. We need her gone before the vote. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. Patricia's face drained of color. Lies, she shouted. This is fabrication. James smiled grimly. Funny, since it's your voice. Recorded legally, and corroborated by multiple documents. The council chair looked rattled. This is highly irregular. But before he could finish, the doors at the back of the chamber swung open. Men and women in dark jackets entered, flashing badges. FBI. The lead agent strode forward. Patricia Collins, members of the council, you are under investigation for bribery, corruption, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Please stand. Chaos erupted. Patricia stumbled backward, her pearls rattling against her chest. You can't do this to me, she shrieked as agents moved in. I built this city. Robert's gaze was unflinching. No, you tried to sell it. The room exploded in shouts and applause as Patricia and her allies were led out in handcuffs. When order returned, the chair cleared his throat, visibly shaken. Proposal number 317 is hereby withdrawn. The Harlem housing block will remain protected under city housing ordinances. No further redevelopment will proceed. The chamber erupted in cheers. Harlem families embraced one another, tears streaming down their cheeks. Danielle buried her face in her hands, overcome with relief. And Ethan, quiet, fragile Ethan, gripped Amira's hand and whispered, We did it. Amira turned to him, her eyes shining. No, Ethan. You did it. You stood up. That's braver than anything. Outside City Hall, the press swarmed. Microphones shoved forward, cameras flashing, questions firing from every direction. Mr. Mitchell, why did you risk your company's reputation? Robert held Ethan's shoulder firmly, Danielle and Amira standing close. His voice was low, steady, but it carried. Because reputations don't matter if they're built on silence. My son taught me that friendship, compassion, and justice matter more than all the wealth in the world. If protecting one child's dignity costs me every contract I have, so be it. That's a price I'll pay. The crowd erupted in applause. For once, the narrative was not controlled by polished elites, but by the truth, raw, undeniable, and alive. That night, back at the Harlem apartment, Danielle lit a single candle on the kitchen table. For victory, she said softly. Amira clapped her hands. For hope. And Ethan, smiling through tears, whispered, For friendship. Robert sat quietly, watching them. He had stood in countless boardrooms, but never had he felt such power, not the power of control, but the power of standing for something true. The council showdown was over, but in his heart he knew the real fight. The fight for healing, for rebuilding, was only beginning. 6 months had passed since the showdown at Stamford City Hall, but its echoes still reverberated across Connecticut and New York. Newspapers had run the story for weeks. Council corruption exposed by CEO and Harlem family. Editorials debated the deeper meaning. Was this a turning point for class and race in America, or just another scandal soon to be forgotten? For Robert Mitchell, it was neither. For him, it was the beginning of a different life. The Mitchell estate in Greenwich had changed. The once sterile halls, polished to impress shareholders, now carried the hum of children's laughter. Amira's drawings decorated the refrigerator. Ethan's chess set remained on the living room table, always ready for the next match. And in the garden, where silence once ruled, flowers bloomed, planted by two small pairs of hands, tended with patience. Robert himself had changed, too. His mornings were no longer consumed by Wall Street calls. Instead, he split his time, part in Stamford with his company, part in Harlem, overseeing a new project that meant more to him than any quarterly report. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals had launched the Buy One, Give One program. For every dose of life-saving medication sold to wealthy hospitals and clinics, one dose was provided free to children in underprivileged communities. It was controversial at first. Investors questioned the cost. Analysts doubted the sustainability. But when Robert stood before them and said, "True wealth is measured not by profit margins but by lives healed," they had no choice but to listen. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the new Harlem Community Health and Education Center, Robert stood with Danielle Johnson at his side. The building gleamed with fresh paint, classrooms filled with books, and medical wings stocked with supplies. Danielle had been appointed Director of Community Outreach for Mitchell Pharmaceuticals. She wore her badge with quiet pride, knowing the program was no longer a dream whispered at night, but a mission backed by resources. "This center isn't just about medicine," Danielle said at the podium, her voice steady despite the cameras. "It's about dignity, about telling our children that their health matters, their future matters, their lives matter. Thank you to everyone who believed this was possible." Amira, sitting in the front row, clapped furiously. Ethan, beside her in his wheelchair, grinned. "Your mom's amazing," Ethan whispered. Amira puffed her chest. "I told you so." In the months since the showdown, Ethan and Amira had become something unexpected, a symbol. Schools across New York invited them to speak about friendship and resilience. One afternoon at a middle school in the Bronx, Ethan rolled up to the microphone while Amira adjusted it for his height. "My name is Ethan Mitchell," he began, his voice still soft but growing stronger with every word. "I used to think no one wanted to be my friend because I was in a wheelchair. And then I met Amira. She didn't see me as broken. She saw me as me. And that changed everything." Amira stepped up next to him. "And I used to think I was too small to make a difference. But then I sang a birthday song, and it changed both of our lives." If kids can be friends no matter where they come from, why can't adults? The room erupted in applause. Teachers wiped their eyes, reporters scribbled notes, and Robert, watching from the wings, felt his chest swell with pride. His son, once afraid to even enter a cafeteria, was now standing before strangers and telling the truth. Back in Greenwich, the house itself bore signs of renewal. The grand dining table, once set only for corporate dinners, now hosted community meals. Doctors from Harlem, neighbors from Greenwich, families from across the city gathered under the same roof. Walls that once divided now connected. Ethan was thriving. Therapy sessions, aided by the center's staff, had strengthened his body. He still used the wheelchair, but his spirit was no longer bound by it. He played chess with Amira, studied with her, even teased her about her wild ideas of running her own hospital someday. "You'll be the boss," he laughed one evening. "And you'll be my best doctor," she shot back. "I can't even walk." "You don't need to. You've got the brain." Their laughter carried out into the garden, where Robert often stood, listening with tears in his eyes. Patricia Collins, once queen of Westport society, had vanished from the headlines after her indictment. The world had moved on, but Robert never forgot the lesson. Power built on cruelty always collapses, and though he had enemies left in high places, he no longer feared them, because he had found something they could never touch. Family. Not the kind bound only by blood, but by choice, by love, by the simple courage to stand together against the storm. One autumn afternoon, Robert visited the Harlem Center. In the pediatric ward, children played with donated toys, nurses bustled between rooms, and laughter echoed down the hall. He watched Danielle speak to a young mother in Spanish, gently explaining her child's treatment. He watched Amira hand out crayons to children in the waiting room. He watched Ethan wheel beside her, guiding a little boy through a puzzle. And Robert realized this wasn't charity. It was justice. Justice, born from a lonely birthday party in Greenwich when no one came, except for one little girl with nothing to give but her song. That evening, as they drove back home, Ethan looked at his father. "Dad, are you happy?" Robert paused, staring at the road ahead. "I thought happiness was about winning, about being the best, the richest, the most powerful. But I was wrong." He glanced at his son, then at Amira in the back seat, humming softly. "Happiness is right here, in this car." In laughter, in friendship, in healing. Ethan smiled, leaning back. For the first time since the accident, his world felt whole again. Spring returned to Greenwich like a soft hymn. The air was gentle, the lawns bright with daffodils, and the Mitchell estate, once a fortress of silence, now hummed with life. The house that had once felt like a museum of wealth had become a home filled with drawings taped to walls, chess pieces scattered under couches, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Yet the most remarkable change lay in the garden. Once tended only by hired landscapers, it now bore the marks of smaller, humbler hands. Rows of marigolds, sunflowers, and herbs grew in raised beds that Ethan and Amira had planted together. The soil bore witness to laughter, to muddy shoes, to mistakes and second chances. It was their sanctuary, their garden of healing. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Robert wheeled Ethan out to the garden while Amira skipped beside them, carrying a packet of seeds. She was 6, but she moved with the determination of someone who understood her work mattered. "Today we plant tomatoes," she announced, dropping to her knees in the soil. Ethan chuckled. "Last time you planted carrots upside down." Amira stuck out her tongue. That was practice. Robert watched from the patio, arms folded, a smile softening the lines of his face. For decades he had measured success in quarterly reports and profit margins. Now he measured it in seeds, in small hands pressing soil, in the sound of his son's laughter returning. Later that day, the phone rang inside. Robert stepped in to answer. On the other end was a voice he hadn't expected. "Robert." It was Patricia Collins. Robert's grip tightened. "Patricia." There was no steel in her voice now, only weariness. I lost everything. The charges, the trial. The papers call me a disgrace. I live in a one-bedroom apartment now. No friends left. No pearls. No seat at the club. Just silence. Robert said nothing. Patricia's voice cracked. "I wanted to call, to say, I'm sorry. I was wrong. About Ethan. About Amira. About Harlem. About all of it." For a long moment, Robert closed his eyes. He thought of the council chamber, of the children's humiliation, of the way she had weaponized prejudice. But he also thought of Amira's words, spoken so many times, "Better than being sad." "Patricia," he said at last, his voice calm but firm, "your apology isn't mine to accept. It belongs to the community you tried to destroy. If you want forgiveness, go there. Earn it. Help rebuild what you tried to take away. Only then will your words matter." There was silence, then a broken whisper. "Thank you." Robert hung up, setting the phone gently back in its cradle. That evening, as the sun lowered, Ethan and Amira planted the last of the tomato seeds. The garden glowed gold in the fading light. Ethan leaned back in his chair, dirt smudged across his fingers. "Dad," he said softly, "if no one had come to my birthday that day, if Amira hadn't walked in, would we still be here?" Robert crouched beside him, his voice thick with emotion. "No, son. That day changed everything. One small act of kindness lit a fire the world couldn't put out." Amira looked up, smiling. "See? My birthday song was magic." Robert chuckled, ruffling her braids. "Yes, Amira, pure magic." Months later, the garden flourished. Tomatoes ripened, sunflowers towered taller than Amira, and herbs filled the air with fragrance. On weekends, neighbors came, families from Harlem, friends from Ethan's new school, even doctors and nurses from the health center. They worked side by side, hands in soil, building something together. It wasn't just a garden. It was a declaration that friendship could outlast cruelty, that compassion could outshine prejudice, that healing could grow in the very soil once tainted by silence. On the anniversary of Ethan's lonely birthday, they held a new celebration. This time, the garden itself was the party. Tables were set under the blooming trees, filled with food from Harlem kitchens and Greenwich caterers alike. Children ran across the lawn, their laughter weaving into music. Ethan sat at the head of the table, Amira beside him, a small crown of daisies resting on his head. When the cake arrived, simple chocolate, Amira's favorite, he closed his eyes to make a wish. When he blew out the candles, he didn't wish for legs that could walk again. He didn't wish for wealth or for friends who had abandoned him. He wished for what he already had: belonging. Later, as twilight painted the sky in violet and gold, Robert stood at the edge of the garden, watching the children dance under strings of lights. Danielle joined him, her expression peaceful. "You did it," she said softly. "No," Robert replied, his eyes never leaving Ethan and Amira. "They did. Those two children taught us all what matters." Danielle smiled. "Sometimes the smallest hands hold the biggest lessons." Robert nodded, his chest full. "True wealth," he whispered, "isn't measured in money. It's measured in compassion." As the night deepened, the garden glowed like a sanctuary. Ethan and Amira planted one more seed together before bed, pressing it gently into the soil. "What's this one?" Ethan asked. "A sunflower," Amira said with certainty. "They always turn to the light." Ethan smiled, looking up at the stars. "Just like us." And in that moment, under the canopy of a healing garden, a boy once broken and a girl once overlooked proved that kindness could change not just two lives, but an entire world. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very end of this journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe so we can keep sharing more healing stories together. See you in the next one.